I'm Nancy Hazard, and Emily Green and I are going to be your moderators this afternoon. Our workshop is called Homelessness, Our Housing Crisis and a Call to Action. This workshop is part of a forum called Housing is a Human Right. We Can Make It Happen. The forum is organized by Green and Greenfield and the Franklin County Continuing the Political Revolution, also known as FCCPR, to address our housing crisis. This is the sixth episode of 9. Our workshop, as I noted, is going to focus on the homeless, and on low-income people and others who are on the brink of becoming homeless. Through this lens, we will continue the forum's discussion about how we can create a community that offers safe, affordable homes, homes that are accessible to all, regardless of economic status, the color of our skin, physical abilities, ethnicity, and sexual or religious orientation. Emily and I have sat on the organizing committee for 2 years, and I've learned a huge amount. We've all learned a huge amount. I have a much deeper understanding of how our government, corporations, and individuals have all contributed to making housing hard to find and expensive. We learned from Gina Giovanni of the Regional Housing Authority that we need in Franklin County 1,200 new units now, and in 3 short years, we will be short 2,500 units. Keynoter UMass professor Brian Sargent reviewed how people of color were left out or blatantly discriminated against over and over again by our government and by private developers. The workshop, A Corporate Capitalist Society, highlighted how housing has become a commodity, an investment for the wealthy. It is no wonder that the number of unhoused people has grown in recent years at an alarming rate. 2 years ago, an approach to address housing and homeless caught my eye when I read an article about how Finland was making a difference using a philosophy called Housing First. This approach recognizes that to resolve homelessness, the first step is to offer housing to everyone who wants it, and then work with those people to help them overcome barriers to moving their lives forward, no matter what those barriers are. They found that when they offered housing, after a year, about half of the newly housed people were able to overcome many barriers, and many held jobs and were better integrated into society. This article about Finland's experience led me to organizations in the United States who also use the Housing First philosophy. I ended up looking at New York City, then Boston, and then that led me back to Franklin County, to home. Today, Emily and I have invited 3 amazing people from Franklin County and Boston to share their experiences with us. We will first hear a personal story about being homeless and overcoming it. Then 2 people from the continuum of care will talk about our challenges in Franklin County and what they are doing. And finally, we will hear from the executive director of the Pine Street Inn in Boston, which has been working to bring the Housing First philosophy to reality in Boston for the past 50 years. After each speaker, there will be an opportunity to ask questions for that speaker. As noted in the rules slide, which is being posted again, for questions, please use the chat box. At the bottom of that window, choose Personal Message for Emily Green and write your question. After everyone has spoken and we've had the Q&A for each of those people, we will have an in-depth discussion and brainstorming about what we can do in Franklin County to meet the needs of unhoused people in our communities. Now I'm going to turn the floor over to Emily to welcome you and introduce our speakers. Emily, you're muted.
Technological age we're in. Okay. Nancy and I are truly thrilled to see so many of you interested in how we can look further into a real change in our country when it comes to the basic need of housing. Are we just going to put another Band-Aid on the problem, or are we going to take steps to realizing that housing is a human right, not a privilege? As you think about this and hear our three speakers telling their stories of working on homelessness, I'd like to share first a few things to think about. Benjamin Applebaum, who sits on the New York Times editorial board, noted in an op-ed in May of 2020, a year ago, the following: the nation's homeless population could be housed for 10 billion a year, less than the price of one aircraft carrier, plus other things. Nancy and I feel we can look at ways to take steps to address the system of economic inequality that has led to an increasing number of people ending up homeless, even while working hard at a job. We are reaching out to all of you to help us find those steps in coordination with what you hear from our speakers. Please stay muted during the presentations. Our first speaker is Shondell Diaz, who is going to share her incredible personal story. Taken from her own words, my name is Shondell Diaz. I am Puerto Rican and was born and raised in Springfield, Mass. I was homeless twice in 2012 and again in 2015 to 16 with 4 children. Through the home-based program, I was able to finally move into the last apartment I was in for 4 years before I bought my first house in October of 2020, this past fall. Shondell is a true inspiration that there is hope and that we should work for everyone to be able to thrive. Now I'll turn the program over to Shondell.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Shondell Diaz. I am a 30-year-old married mom of 4 who likes long walks in the park. Oh, sorry, wait, that's not this type of meeting. All right, so I am also Shondell Diaz, Coordinated Entry Specialist for the 3-County Continuum of Care Community Action Pioneer Valley. I come today to share my homeless journey, which started in 2012. In 2012, the father of 3 of my children and husband at the time walked out on me and my children. At the time, I was working as a traveling CNA and had to work 72 to 80 hours a week just to make ends meet the best way possible. Unfortunately, the money I made did not stretch enough to pay a $1,500 rent, food, bills, and gas. I literally had no time to be a mother to my children, who at the time were 12, 7, 6, and 5 years old. From working so many hours and constantly worrying, I burned myself out. And I've always lived by the saying, you can't help anyone if you can't help yourself. Shortly before October of 2012, I was evicted. Thankfully, I had a friend that had a home in Holyoke where I could stay with my children. Even though my children and I were crammed into a single bedroom, I was thankful to at least have a roof over our heads. But this opportunity only lasted a couple months. My friend too was having issues paying her mortgage and ended up losing her home, and we found ourselves back on the street. My mother, who lives in subsidized housing, would welcome my children in to eat, shower, and sleep some nights. But because we were not on her lease, I did not want to jeopardize her housing. When my children could not stay because it was becoming too obvious, we would all sleep in my Suburban. I went to RAF to get assistance to get an apartment, and I was awarded first, last, and deposit, but I had to find the apartment myself. Although I looked all over, the availability was minimal, but I found an apartment that was within my pay range, even though it was run down and super small. After a while, my children, who have asthma, started getting constantly sick, and we found that there was mold behind the walls and above the push-up ceilings. I tried to ask the landlord to fix things, but they came, did some cost-effective, cheap repairs, and that really didn't fix anything. It just cosmetically looked good. I started to hold rent. In the process of trying to get code enforcement to come out, I also lost my job, and the landlord had me evicted. Now, maybe if I would have had some case management, or at least a connection to a caseworker, the outcome may have been different. We then ended up homeless again. I did call Raft, who stated that they could not help me because I was within a time period that they have already helped me. The good thing is that I had a friend who told me to apply for the home-based program, which I did. And I'm very thankful that I did because I was able to be rehoused in a better apartment that was a bit bigger, and I got some case management. The first couple of months, I had a caseworker who asked me to report and show proof that I was paying my bills on time, which I was able to do due to the fact that I got a job at Starbucks Center for Independent Living, and I was able to get a new to me car. My caseworker helped me do a real budget, but after 6 months, I was on my own. I was the one who pushed myself to repair my credit, pay my bills on time, because I did not want to put my children through the same trauma again. After 4 years, along with my now husband, we were able to save money and buy our first own home. One of the reasons I chose to tell my story as a person with lived experience of homelessness is because without the proper connections, without motivation from these connections, and without stability, I could have easily fallen back into homelessness and maybe would have had my children taken away from me. I did not become homeless because of substance abuse, mental health, or because I was uneducated. Actually, I was in the process of finishing my bachelor's in business management, which I had to put on the back burner, and to this day have only a couple credits to finish. Now, for a person who does not have these supports or knowledge of resources in the community, it is easy to fall back into homelessness and of no fault of their own. We as a community, as folks that have come into the homeless world, advocacy world, have to do better. We have to make change at a systemic level so that there is help making these connections. Thank you. You're muted, Emily.
Our next speakers are Kelly Pereira and Shondell Diaz again from 3-County Continuum of Care at Community Action. Kelly, the program director, has worked locally for almost 2 decades, managing programs as the program director for providing housing and services for low-income and homeless populations. For the past 2 years, she has been a Community Action Pioneer Valley, overseeing the work of the 3-County Continuum of Care, which provides funding for efforts by nonprofits, area stakeholders, and government entities to house individuals and families experiencing homelessness in a housing first model. In this role, she has led local efforts to increase community commitment to ending homelessness and the effectiveness and equity of systems that support this vulnerable population. Shondell works for the 3-County Continuum of Care with Kelly as the coordinated entry specialist. She does vulnerability assessments, case conferencing, and works with many agency partners to find shelter and eventually a home for the homeless. Both Kelly and Shondell work very hard every day to find solutions to this increasing housing crisis with compassion and caring that is often emotionally draining. Now I turn it over to Kelly and Shondell.
So Emily, could we back up and have a few questions for Shondell?
Oh, yes, we
So
certainly
many things to remember.
thank you for jumping in there, Nancy. So far, sorry about that. Okay, Shondell, a question that has come in is, after your experience with homelessness, what changes did you feel needed to be made to the 3-County Continuum of Care to help the homeless asking for help? And did these changes get made?
So I was not homeless in the 3-county area. I was homeless in Hamden County. That's one. But I feel that my lived experience and what I bring to the table is it's a revolving door, right? So everything that we do at the COC, I have what my experience is taken into account, but not only mine. We're trying to include everybody that has lived experience, and we're constantly on the look for those folks in the community.
Great, great. And I'm going to be going through our chat box. So if you have questions, please put questions in there. And Shondell, a question is, when a person with disabilities approaches you for help as the coordinated entry specialist, do you actually pull them into your continuum of care and work with them there? Or is there other organizations that would work with somebody with the complication of disabilities?
So during case conferencing, we have a by names list, and our highest vulnerability and people included in that are folks with disabilities, right? And most of our 8 partner agencies do work with these folks. And because of my background as an options counselor from Stavros, at Stavros, I have a bountiful collection of resources. So during case conferencing, I try to bring those resources and assist our partner agencies to connect those folks to those resources.
Okay, great. I'm seeing some wonderful comments here. Thanking you for sharing your story. And I also feel the same way that, you know, I think it really hits our heart when we hear how someone has had to go through this incredible situation of being homeless, and with 4 children. That's amazing. I'm not sure if this would be something that you would like to answer, but I'm going to put it out there. How many beds are there in the emergency shelters in comparison to how many homeless do need the shelters? And are these shelters equipped to deal with the ADA standards?
So that is something we'll probably be talking and touching base on during our presentation. So, and if not, that's something we can find out for you.
Okay, great, great. I'm just gonna.
This should probably be our last question.
Okay, all righty. I am, okay. One more question, and I'm, you know, not sure if this is one that's going to be addressed in the your talk, so it's fine if we don't actually do that. I noticed some statistics that show that the number of homeless have gone down during the year of COVID in comparison to the previous year. When it came to emergency shelter and transitioning housing. And I don't know if there's an answer to that one or not.
That's also something we're going to be touching base on during our presentation.
Okay, okay, then that sounds great. I think we can go ahead then, and would you all like me to read my introduction for Kelly and Shondell again? I can. No, okay. So I'd like to now turn this over to Kelly and Shondell, who will be answering some of the questions that I asked Shondell, but wasn't sure, you know, if those were questions that would be answered in our program. And I'm going to now let Kelly and Shondell take over.
So Kelly, you want to be sure to unmute yourself.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you so much for having us. Again, I'm Kelly Pereira. I'm the 3-County Continuum of Care Program Director at Community Action Pioneer Valley. And before we get started on the presentation, I just wanted to kind of reiterate what I'm hearing from the presenters so far in this conversation, which is that homelessness has many current in the moment causes, which might include job loss, mental health concerns, lack of support systems, addiction. But the reality is that root causes go much deeper than that, and there are systemic issues at play. Advocating for an end to homelessness includes the work that the COC does and what you're going to hear later from Lindy, but it also includes changing the perceptions of people of experiencing homelessness in our community and the marginalization of people who are living in poverty here. So Just one second, sorry. So the Three County COC is a federally funded project to organize the efforts across the county in ending homelessness. We are a planning body that supports the coordinated plans of our local municipalities. We oversee funding and monitor programs within various agencies that provide housing and supportive services to people experiencing homelessness. Our continuum includes transitional housing, rapid rehousing, and permanent supportive housing programs in Berkshire, Hampshire, and Franklin counties. We coordinate the system for access, for those housing projects. And we are required by HUD to collect and report data on our programs, shelters in our communities in order to determine the needs for our region. We use what you heard before, which is a housing first model, meaning that we set expectations of the programs that we oversee, that they have limited to no barriers to housing. We are housing a population of mostly chronically homeless who are often, due to their long-term homelessness, managing issues like mental and physical health concerns, addiction, and who have often been denied other housing opportunities. And we work to minimize the traumatic experiences of homelessness and to help promote self-sufficiency for those in these programs to have a move-on strategy for next steps. The COC joined Community Action Pioneer Valley in 2019 when we became what's called the collaborative applicant. And what this means is that we receive the funding and administer this funding to other agencies that provide the programs. One thing that's really different for us as a program of community action is the system level work that we do versus direct service. We use a collective impact model through our committees and board of directors, project representatives, and we work with the Western Mass Network to end homelessness. But we also do this by approaching the work from a public health perspective, a national alliance perspective, a systems change approach. And we support and coordinate aligned activities, establish shared measurement practices, work to build public will, and most importantly, we work to advance the priorities of those who are most impacted and those who have lived experience of homelessness. This visual gives you a sense of the membership of the Three County COC. It includes both staff and participants of our funded projects, our board of directors, our coordinated entry partners, and all of you. Basically, it includes everyone who's interested in addressing the effects of homelessness in our communities and those most impacted by disparities that affect people living in and managing poverty. In Massachusetts, there are 13 COCs, which is unusual. Normally across the United States, there are 1 to 3 COCs. So we get to work and coordinate programming and data collection across the system. Our continuum is very rural and crosses 1,600 square miles in the Three County area. As of October 2020, we have the capacity for approximately 183 units of funded housing programs for families or individuals. So that's incredibly small. The number of individuals experiencing homelessness has more than doubled since 1990. On any given night in Massachusetts, there are approximately 3,000 shelter beds that are over capacity. 18,471 people in Massachusetts were counted as experiencing homelessness during the January 2019 point in time count. And these numbers are in reference to chronic homelessness. It's important to note that when we are counting folks for the point in time count, we are often excluding people who are doubled up, staying on people's couches, not just literally homeless. That information is collected annually by COCs, and what I said before was the point in time count, which counts every person experiencing homelessness on one given night in January. So this is really just a literal snapshot. In 2020, we counted 450 people experiencing homelessness in the Three County area. This year's count is still preliminary. We knew that due to COVID, we would have a very different count based on safety precautions and other concerns. But we have noted so far that we have seen far fewer people who were counted that were literally outside. And this is very different. We're learning that because of the option of hotel rooms for depopulating shelters, that might have affected our count as well as the count itself. Here's some comparison between the time frame of the start of the pandemic to mid-January in the same time frame for 2019 to 2020. There's a striking decrease you can see in shelter and TH placements. TH is transitional housing. It's saying a lot. We know that our shelters have experienced the need over this past year to have to minimize capacity at various times for depopulation, for social distancing, and at times for testing expectations. Over the winter, though, we did get to see an increased capacity of shelters due to the ability to utilize hotel rooms. And at this point, our state is moving to end the hotel and motel stays by June 30th, and our community is working really effectively together to find permanent housing options. And I'm going to turn it over to Chandal to talk through our coordinated entry system.
The information provided here was provided by Rose Webster Smith of Springfield No One Leaves Home or Homes for All Mass Coalition. The number of evictions since the eviction moratorium was lifted on October 17, 2020 is what is displayed here. This information is about only evictions that were filed with the courts. Landlords are able to provide notices to quit without going to court. So we believe that these are just evictions shared by the sheriff's office. Massachusetts is working on a bill that is new eviction moratorium moving through the legislation, and our COC was contacted just this morning by state legislators to consider how that bill in its current form might look to affect our rural environment. They are looking for our feedback, so community members should always feel confident in sharing your concerns with the COC so that we can share it with those moving legislative actions. To give a sense of the coordinated entry work we do, HUD created this system in 2018, so it is very new. Its purpose is to provide equity to housing access. Partner agencies work to provide assessments for people experiencing homelessness, sheltered or unsheltered. Often these agencies are working with this family or individual in outreach or case management. Locally, we work with partners like ServiceNet, Elliott Human Services, and Dial Self Youth and Community Services. The COC then builds a by names list in order of vulnerability score. The person with the highest vulnerability score is placed at the top. The assessment process includes 4 steps: standardized access, assessment, prioritization, and referral. This is a list of our current coordinated entry partnerships across the continuum. You will notice that some say assessors. These are people currently training or being trained on conducting vulnerability assessments and identifying placements from the coordinated entry by names list into COC project placements. This community will prioritize the following in a housing first, low barrier, person choice, and multi-site centralized access, meaning at several locations in a community, sometimes referred to as hubs or hybrid approach. Main purposes of coordinated entry is to ensure that people with the most severe service needs and levels of vulnerability are prioritized for housing and homelessness assistance. HUD's policies is that people experiencing chronic homelessness should be prioritized for permanent supportive housing. We consider prioritization principles and vulnerability factors like significant health or behavioral health challenges or functional impairments, which require significant level of support in order to maintain permanent housing, high utilization of crisis or emergency services, including emergency rooms, jails, and psychiatric facilities to meet basic needs, the extent to which people, especially youth and children, are unsheltered, vulnerability to illness or death, risk of continued homelessness, vulnerability or victimization, including physical assault, trafficking, or sex work, or other factors determined by the community and based on severity of needs. Our community uses a community-specific assessment tool that is built out of the Arizona Matrix. We follow our COC's written standards for prioritization, hold weekly case conference meetings, and the needs of this group. We hold a CE coordinated entry committee that provides feedback quarterly to how the system is running and helps us to ensure equity. And now I'll turn it back to Kelly.
So you'll see here on the slide, this is a list of our sort of continuum of care housing options. We try to be sure that we are providing housing opportunities that meet the needs of the individuals we are serving versus just a one-size-fits-all type of component. In Franklin County specifically, this is a list of organizations that we work with who provide housing that we fund. A Positive Place through Cooley Dickinson Hospital has 14 units that are across Hampshire, Franklin, and Hampden County. We have the Center for Human Development has a 48-bed permanent supportive housing project, which is located in Hampshire, Franklin, and Berkshire counties. Dial Self Youth and Community Services has 10 beds in what's called a joint component. It's transitional housing and rapid rehousing opportunities for youth and young adults. We have a Shelter Plus Care program through ServiceNet, which has 22 units in Hampshire and Franklin County. That program is specifically a permanent supportive housing program that serves individuals that are eligible for DMH services. And then, as some of you have probably heard, we have a new youth and young adult homelessness population programming, and that includes Dial Self Youth and Community Services, who has a rapid rehousing project for youth and young adult beds for individuals with supportive services. Gandara has a joint component program similar to that of the Dial Self one, which is transitional housing and rapid rehousing together, which means youth choice. It gives opportunity for young adults to get to choose whether their circumstances mean they have the need for transitional housing or rapid rehousing, or they might be able to do both. Mental Health Association has a housing navigation service program with us, and also has within that program connection to short-term housing resources for up to 6 beds annually. And Mental Health Association also has a permanent supportive housing project, which is long-term housing and services for youth and young adults with disabilities, serving up to 8 youth and young adults annually. In addition to those COC funded projects, many of the agencies that I've just mentioned and others have other services and housing programs that expand beyond the COC that we also work to help connect folks to. Chandal?
So Franklin County was designated a youth homeless demonstration project community and underwent a year-long planning process for addressing youth homelessness in Franklin County. We underwent a creation of a coordinated community plan to prevent and end homelessness. We consider addressing barriers to homelessness holistically, emergency options, private market housing, other kinds of vouchers and programs, and also track whether someone is unified with family or diverted out of homelessness in other ways.
So thanks. So as mentioned before, Western Mass legislators are supporting us in this work and looking for our feedback. And so you might be wondering, what can you do? Well, you can be engaging in the budget and policy priorities supported by our advocacy partners. You could join the Western Mass Network to End Homelessness website and blog. You could support the Mass Housing and Shelter Alliance budget priorities, join the mailing list for the Massachusetts Coalition for the Homeless, contact your legislators to suggest what we need locally, more financial resources, increased housing opportunities, meet with your municipal representatives to join their committees that are addressing the needs of the homeless population, and join the work of the COC.
As an implementation body, the COC has lots of initiatives that our committees oversee or provide feedback on. We host 5 committees and some work groups. Currently, our Equity and Inclusions Committee pays attention to the accessibility of programs and services for specific vulnerable populations. Our Coordinated Entry Committee pays attention to the system of access and assessment to COC programs. Our Data and Evaluation Committee is responsible for the oversight of our data quality, develops protocols and agreements for our funded agencies to follow. Our Ranking Evaluation Committee is a committee responsible for the performance of our funded projects and their annual evaluations. Our Youth and Young Adult Homelessness Committee is responsible for moving forward the coordinated community plan to end youth homelessness. Centering racial equity in our homeless response is more urgent than ever. We have spent more than a year working with consultants to analyze our data to determine how the local homelessness response is centering the needs of people of color. We have provided trainings for the community, held strategy sessions with our projects and our coordinated entry partner agencies to consider our goals, and based on that, to develop a long-term plan for disrupting racism in our COC system of care. Through the strategies outlined in this plan, we will work together to center racial equity in everything that we do to prevent and end homelessness in Franklin, Hampshire, and Berkshire counties. And we need more people at the table. Our housing programs are committed to the mission of preventing and ending homelessness in Western Massachusetts by building and maintaining strong, mutually beneficial partnerships with local landlords and owners. These programs provide a level of assurance to landlords regarding rent payments, tenancy supports, and case management and mediation services that seeks to ensure leases and property expectations are maintained. The three-county COC is dedicated to advancing the voices of people with lived experience of homelessness and its work and its impact. These voices are often absent at decision-making tables, and along with partner coalitions, the COC is committed to the policy-making principle of nothing about us without us. This policy intends to recognize the expertise, value, and time of the people who receive them, and to ensure that people who can provide this perspective are present when needed. We have and will continue to identify funding resources to support the inclusion of diverse perspectives in the COC's work. We also are creating a flyer to share among our partner participants and the community to bring folks with lived experience to participate in our various committees. And we are specifically working to engage people with lived experience in the work of the COC, including some current board of director openings and a liaison for landlord engagement activities. So please be in touch with me if you know anyone that might be a great fit or connect to any of our staff.
So lastly, and before questions, I just want to share that about $4.5 billion of relief is coming to the state budget from the American Rescue Plan. We've seen a breakdown of funds that include opportunities for increased housing development, additional vouchers for rent relief, development of supportive services programming, acquisition and development of non-congregate shelter. We have an opportunity to, instead of thinking about how to stretch the dollars, moving from the possibility of abundance. The COCs in Western Massachusetts are already talking with municipal leaders, housing providers, developers to consider what might be possible here in our rural environment. Ending homelessness, which really just means having the resources to support someone once they've become homeless and find them access to housing options that meet their needs, is possible here. It really is if there's a strong enough investment.
Okay, I would like to really thank Kelly and Chandel for this presentation because I've learned a lot, you know, even just today on the things that they have gone over. I wonder what is happening as far as Franklin County in particular, in the light of realizing that there is really an increasing number of mid-age to senior population that are many of them, especially the seniors, once they're on their Social Security, there isn't much that they can afford except subsidized housing. And so I wonder, you know, what we can do about that situation as well. And I'm thoroughly glad that we're dealing with the youth and the people with addictions and so forth. But I also want to find out how are we fixing this situation that's now going to become a tsunami? Because I'm from the baby boom generation, and believe me, that there's going to be a lot of us that can't afford to live in most of the housing that's out there. So is there a way you could help us to know how that will deal with that situation.
Yeah. So I just want to say that in our vulnerability assessment, a lot of what we are considering is health concerns, and that comes up a lot in terms of our, aging population. We're really aware that there is a population in need. And I will say that lots of times the individuals that we end up serving are, an older generation, because of that vulnerability assessment, the way that the assessment works. We're really identifying if someone is going to be harmed being outside, and their health risks are a demonstrating factor around that, then we're certainly paying attention to that piece. I know that I'm not seeing all of the chats coming into the chat box, but I did just see one that came in. And so from Becca, I think it was, who asked what our relationship is to the Western Mass Housing First organization. That's the Western Mass Network to End Homelessness that I mentioned, actually. And so our COC actually sits on the steering committee for Pamela's organization. And we work very closely. She sits on some of our committees, and we participate in a lot of this work together.
I just wanted to also, I saw a question about what we can do to help the seniors stay in their homes when they cannot fix their own homes. And I just wanted to throw out there again, resource pocket. Each housing authority has an emergency repair application that goes by income. And sometimes the fees are waived, especially for the elderly, to help their own homes. It's like as long as the elderly stay in their home, they won't have to repay this loan. So that's something that you should know, and as well as connecting them to their local senior centers or their independent living centers such as Stavros, and that works in our area, as well as, oh geez, I can't remember the other one, but yes, sorry.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. We have a question. Considering the changes from the period of the pandemic, do you expect that the incidence of homelessness will increase next fall or winter?
That's such a good question. I mean, I think, certainly many of us who are dealing with homelessness or supporting those who are experiencing poverty, we've certainly seen a lot more people that are showing up in need of resources that have never needed resources previously. I think also, the reality of the eviction moratoriums, the federal moratorium, the one that's being considered for Massachusetts, I think that the reality is that at some point, once that's ended, it's very likely, very possible that we might see folks that end up in, more dire circumstances once that moratorium is lifted. And I'm hopeful that some of the resources that are coming into the communities to address what's happening now are going to help support that.
Thank you. Here's another question. Is there a family PSH option in the 3-county area, or is there a different system for family HOH with disabilities?
Mm-hmm. So we do have some family housing. Most of our family housing in Franklin County is for youth and young adults. So, the head of household would be under the age of 25. And so, we have more limited family housing in the COC programming, and that's mostly because of the emergency access system through the state that provides support for families, more so than the individuals that we serve in the COC. We do have some family housing, but it is more limited.
Okay.
Emily, this will have to be your last question.
Okay. Let me see here. This is a question about the Housing First model. Is there work in the Franklin County or the 3 counties that would be considered Housing First model work that we are exploring, or that is possibly in the works?
Yeah, so certainly all of the COC funded housing has an expectation that it is housing first. I think oftentimes the population that we are working with are folks who have had trouble accessing other housing resources. Once somebody has been chronically homeless, they've been on their own for quite some time. And that often means that's also, it often includes the reality that there might have been denials before for housing based on previous history, based on lack of income, based on many factors. And so, our work is to help engage in conversations around what housing first means and trying to recognize that, it can be a barrier to landlords. It can be a barrier to programs because it means, that first you give someone housing and then you work with them to effectively think through and set goals for their future and help identify the barriers to maintaining housing. And so it can mean that the struggle is hard for folks. But I think that the conversation continues to be happening across a lot of these systems around housing first, and really recognizing that it's a new opportunity. It's a different way of thinking about providing resources to folks, sort of setting limits to barriers, reducing the number of hoops that need to be jumped through before somebody can be housed. In this particular program, this is what we do.
Okay, thank you very much, Kelly and Shondell. Now we're going to turn to a different area of Massachusetts, Boston. And our last speaker is going to be Lindia Downey, who will present a model for the Housing First approach to homelessness in Boston. We are thrilled to have Lindia join us today to tell us about Pine Street Inn's journey, the challenges, successes, and lessons learned. Nancy discovered Pine Street Inn, as she mentioned earlier, while looking for solutions to homelessness. Lindia has served as Pine Street Inn's president and executive director since 2000. And on the Pine Street staff for 35 years, even longer. As a result of her leadership and vision, Pine Street is now the largest provider of permanent supportive housing for men and women in the New England area, and with 850 units of housing. The Housing First model makes a lot of sense when you consider that in order to have a job, you need to have an address. And if you don't have a job, getting out of homelessness is a very difficult thing to do. Now I turn it over to Lindia.
Emily, thank you very much. And I see already some interesting comments in the chat. I'm going to bring this down a bit more to a provider level, because really what you heard in the previous presentation was the kind of broader regional approach, which Boston uses, really very similar to what you're doing in Western Mass. We too have a coordinated access system. We don't use a vulnerability index to get people into permanent supportive housing. The one criteria is length of homelessness. So the people who have been homeless the longest are on top of any prioritized list. But let me walk through this and then see what kind of questions people have. And I will be brief on some of these, because some of them are just really a little bit of history about Pine Street. Lori, can you go to the next slide? Oh, yep. So Pine Street turned 50 this year, and Pine Street was really started as a shelter. We're called Pine Street Inn because we were on a building on Pine Street in Chinatown. That's about how sophisticated the naming was. And we started as a shelter for men. We shared the space with the Chinese Evangelical Church, and every Sunday we had to had everybody leave at 8 in the morning so the church could come in and have service, and then we had to go in and clean the building and let the men back in again. We moved to the South End in Boston in 1984, opened our first shelter for homeless women. And even though there had always been a handful of women at what was really a men's shelter, we would just put up a sheet or a blanket and let the women sleep literally on the floor in a small space in the lobby. We opened 50 beds for women when we moved to the South End in 1984. And I will tell you, within 6 months, we had 50 women in beds and 50 women sleeping downstairs in our lobby. We had no idea of the demand out there and how many women were experiencing homelessness. And then what I would say is that we evolved really into, we kept the shelter services. We had a transitional program that helped people get sober and get out of homelessness, find employment. We started doing housing development, but it's what I would call a very, very housing reward type system, right? You did all the right things and you ended up in housing. So you got sober, you took your meds, and you were basically compliant. The problem with that approach for as I think, Shondell and Kelly said, that the people who need the housing the most can't get it under that kind of circumstance. So we started really evolving really in two ways. Lori, maybe you can go to the next slide for a minute. Sorry, hold on. No, go back to the original slide. I'm sorry yeah. So really a couple of things happened for us. One was that there was a lot of research going on in New York by a fellow named Dennis Culhane, who some folks on the call know Dennis. He went to BC, but he's now at UPenn. He was looking at the cost benefit analysis of housing chronically homeless people. And what it turns out is that in Massachusetts, we've replicated this study. We did a study about 3 years ago. For every person that's chronically homeless that we place in housing, we save Mass Health about $11,000 per person per year. And why is that? Because people don't go to the emergency rooms. They don't end up inpatient as much. Most of the savings are on the healthcare side, although not all of them are there, but most of them are. And so we started to really look at what would it take to literally take our longest term stayers in housing, our longest term stayers in shelter and on the street, and put them into housing with no strings attached. We got some money from HUD to start a small pilot, a 30 unit scattered site pilot. And so really two things converged, I think, across the state and as certainly in Boston. One is you had the Dennis Culhane research saying there's savings if you put people in housing and don't leave them on the street and in shelter. And then another fellow named Sam Tambaris, who was a psychiatrist at Bellevue, was releasing people from Bellevue Hospital back to the street on pretty much a daily basis, back to shelter, back to the street, because there was no place else for them to go. And when Sam said to people, what do you want? Everyone, of course, said, I want a room, I want an apartment, I want a place to live. And so the convergence of the savings plus the Housing First idea really merged for us. And we opened our first Housing First site, as I said. We picked people that had been homeless the longest. And when I say the longest, one person on that list had been homeless for 18 years, sadly. But everybody else was, 10, 15, 18 years, found units, hired some staff to support folks in these units. And after a year, about 83% of those folks were still housed. And we realized, boy, we had been thinking about this all wrong. If we supported people in housing, they could hold on to their housing and they could start from a place of stability, start from a place of respect, and really start to rebuild their lives. And so now really all of our 850 units of housing use a Housing First philosophy. We don't specifically have a wait list. The way people get into our supportive housing, similar to what you do in Western Mass, is our teams and the rest of the providers in Boston put people into a single database that we all share. The city polls every quarter by length of stay. So we get a list every quarter of about 600 names of folks who have been homeless the longest. And then that same system has us and other housing providers entering vacancies. And so people get matched against a vacancy. It sounds great on paper, doesn't really work that way in reality. But because sometimes people don't want the unit that's available. Sometimes people don't want housing. Sometimes people really are in tough enough shape that they do need some intervention beforehand. But for the most part, that's how the system works. I want to leave you, I do want to leave people with one number that I hope will illustrate a little bit more of why this strategy is so important in terms of reducing homelessness across the Commonwealth. About 18% of the people that come to our shelters, our single shelters, take up 53% of the bed nights in shelter, right? So 18%, about 20% of our folks take up half the bed nights in shelter. And when you can help the folks who are homeless the longest move out, frees up a lot of capacity in shelter. And it allows you to not have to build new shelters. It allows you to keep up with the even sometimes increased demand because you've moved people out that free up a lot of beds. Laura, you want to go to the next slide? This is just a picture of a woman who, funny enough, she's been on my mind because she was someone who was living on the street, staying out. She was actively using. Our street outreach team worked with her for probably 2 or 3 years. She finally came into shelter. She stayed at our women's shelter. She was there for probably almost 2 years. She got on the housing, the priority list because of her length of homelessness. And we were able to get her own apartment in Dorchester. When she left Pine Street, she had a job working for a cruise company, one of the local cruise companies, the boat cruise companies, doing really well, working in their catering division. And then she lost that job last year because of the pandemic, and she was at risk of losing her housing. And it's where Raft and the stuff Shondell talked about really matters. And so she called us and said, look, lost my job, gonna look for another job, but I'm worried about getting evicted. And we were able to work with her and bring some additional resources through Raft to help her get through this stretch. And I think this is what, if there's any takeaway, it's you got to stay with people. Not her fault that the pandemic happened. She was working full time. She was actually doing really fine paying her rent. But then, this tsunami comes that nobody expected, and having that kind of short-term support for people has really made a big difference. Lori, do you want to go to the next slide? So we've been working at Pine Street to add to our supportive housing. We're up to 850 units. We have a goal through our 50th anniversary campaign to getting to 1,000 units, and we're very close. We're this close to getting there. We're going to break ground on 140 new units, I hope, in about a month and a half. But we've also been very, very cognizant that shelter's not a long-term solution for people. And we're working very hard to really think about how do you downsize shelter over time by really providing enough capacity, especially for folks who are homeless for the long term. I will say something for all of our struggles in Massachusetts, and they are many, and we've got a very expensive housing market because we don't build enough housing. And if we just built more housing and we made it affordable, which is not easy, as we all know, we wouldn't be in this mess to begin with. But it's part of the reason we've shifted so much of our focus and resources really into building housing. But despite the fact that over the past 10 years, we've reduced our shelter bed count by almost 30% just at Pine Street, not across the city. The Boston street numbers, which is the number of people who physically stay out, it's about 3% of our total homeless population in Boston stays outside. In San Francisco, Seattle, places like LA, it's almost 50%. So relatively speaking, we're better than some states, but we still have a lot of work to do. And I would mention that at this point, everybody that we're putting in housing is coming directly out of shelter, directly off the street. So there is no transition. You're literally going from wherever you were, hopefully right into a unit. Our retention rate last year, and this is higher than it normally is, was 97%, which means 97% of the folks we placed in supportive housing last year are still there. Normally we're around 93%. I think the pandemic, frankly, had something to do with it. People didn't want to move or so. Laura, you want to go to the next slide? Here's a really quick overview of what we do. We provide street outreach, both daytime and overnight. We have 2 overnight vans that cover Boston and a number of neighborhoods in the city. We have 4 emergency shelters that we run, 1 for women, the other 3 are for men. We're a developer and a manager and a partner in supportive housing, which means sometimes we develop the property ourselves. We find it, we buy it, we put together the funding application, we manage the construction. More often than not, we're a partner in someone who's with a developer, a community development corporation, or in some cases, we've done 2 projects now with a small for-profit developer. A number of years ago, the city gave us some money to do a very small pilot to see if we could do a better job at the front door of shelter, trying to help people who might not have to stay in shelter for the long term, or may not have to stay in shelter at all. And what do I mean by that? Boston's interesting. Sometimes people get stuck in Boston, right? And the story that sticks out for me that made me go to the city and to the mayor and say, could we try this, is, we had in the course of a week, 4 or 5 people who showed up new, 3 of whom, interestingly, were from Western Mass, one of whom had come to Boston for a job and it fell through, and he just wanted to get back to Springfield. That's it. And he came looking for shelter, and we said, you don't need shelter. You need to go back to Springfield where you have a place to stay. We bought him a bus ticket. We had somebody from Salem who had come to Boston for substance abuse treatment, wrapped up his treatment, and the treatment provider said, well, if you don't have a way to get back to Salem, where he had a place to live, go stay at Pine Street for a few nights. Makes no sense. So, right, we bus ticket. Sometimes people can be connected very quickly back to where they came from. Not always, but we have a small pot. We have a small pot of private money that we use for everything from transportation to sometimes we can pay the rent. Sometimes someone's couch surfing. And while this is not a perfect solution, we can pay the rent for 3 or 4 months until we work on something else for this person, and we pay it directly to the leaseholder. Sometimes it's a family conflict, and our staff are doing family mediation with folks. Somebody's actively using, somebody's mentally ill and went off their medication, and we're intervening to say, if this person does X, can they come back home? Can we connect you with other services? So that's what front door triage is. It's not a very sexy name for something that actually has been pretty impactful. And then, like Western Mass, we have a pot of money and a bigger pot since COVID for rapid rehousing, which is you don't need a full rental subsidy, but you need some help. Shondell described it well. First and last month's rent, maybe a few months till you find a job, till you get a roommate. In this case, rapid rehousing at the moment is actually upwards of a year, in some cases longer than that. And we've been using a lot of rapid rehousing money through this pandemic to help people find units. We do provide housing search for folks who get rapid rehousing money. You can find an apartment on your own, but if you can't, we're happy to help you with that. And then there's 3 other things that really kind of support across all of our programs. We have a catering company that we run where we provide food for other nonprofits, and we use that business to employ homeless men and women. They get paid in the business while they're working in the business, and we have a full-time person who does job placement when they wrap up their time in our catering company called I Cater. We have a very, very small laundry business where we do laundry for some other folks, and we use that as well as a job opportunity for folks. We have a substance abuse treatment program, 65 beds over in Jamaica Plain. And we're one of the, there's a handful of homeless courts across the country, and we have one at Pine Street that we run through Boston Municipal Court. And the court is authorized to expunge people's records who have low-level felonies and misdemeanors, as long as people are on the road to housing. And the reason we were so interested in homeless court is one of the things that really prevents people from getting housed is they have an open warrant, they have fines, they have things on their record that are going to prevent them from getting housing or getting a job. And the beauty of homeless court, we have about a 93% success rate in homeless court. And what I mean by that is about 93% of the participants that show up in front of the judge, we can expunge their record. But it means people are working really hard on doing what we've asked them to do, right? Because the local DA, legal aid, and the person's case manager all have to agree that they've done what they've been asked to do to get this record taken away. And it's been highly successful. It has often been the one barrier to getting people rental assistance is their CORI. Laura, you want to go to the next slide? So housing first, I think I talked about it. It's low barrier, which, well, it's as low barrier as we can make it within the bounds of Boston Housing Authority, which is mostly where we work. The housing authorities do have some barriers that they don't have a choice on because HUD has some requirements, but we've worked very, very hard to make housing as low barrier as possible in Boston. So the goal is to connect people with housing as quickly as we can. The key to this, though, is having support services on site for people so that they can hold on to their housing, learn how to pay the rent, how to budget, how to get a job. And if they're not ready for that, at least help them manage the day-to-day life they need to manage, either in one of our units that we build or in scattered site housing. Laura, you want to go to the next one? These are just some pictures of some of the properties we've done. You know, in the early days, and I would say this to all of you in Western Mass, we made a strategic mistake by doing small. And so we buy 10 buildings that we could put 10 units in or 15 units. And these buildings are really tough to site. It's very hard to get zoning relief in Boston and the rest of the state. And as I say to our staff, I don't mind people yelling at me and throwing tomatoes at me at zoning hearings and, you know, telling me I'm an evil person for wanting to house homeless people in their neighborhood, but I don't want to do it for 10 units. So if you're going to get mad at me, it's got to be at least 50 units now because it's so much work. So we're, you know, our most recent project is going to be 140 new units. So we're working really hard to get bigger as opposed to some of the smaller projects, because it's just not having the impact at the small scale. Lori, do you want to go to the next one? These are two of the bigger projects. 3368 is the project I just referred to. It's in Jamaica Plain. We hope to break ground very soon on that. And the Shattuck Hospital, which is a public health hospital in Boston, is going out to bid. And we have a shelter there now. We're really hoping to do some interesting work there with some support, some additional supportive housing. Let's see, Laura, you want to? So supportive housing really needs three things. It needs capital to do purchase and acquisition. It needs funding for support services, which is the hardest piece of this. There's not enough of it. It's hard to patch together. And we need rental subsidies in the form of HUD Section 8s or local rental assistance through the state called mass rental vouchers. But that's really how you get supportive housing done. There is, as I think someone mentioned, there's some new money coming to the state that should make this easier if we're smart about it and target it the right way. There should be some resources out there. We'll see what the state does with it. Laura, you want to go to the next one? And this is really just for those of you that are interested in this stuff and kind of the wonky dollars and all the funding sources that go into building housing. There is money out there for acquisition through the state. Some of it's federal money that comes through the state, some of it's state dollars. Some of it's very directed. For example, the HUD 202 program, that's just for elders, low-income elders. 811 is a program just for people with disabilities. And we've used all of these really to build housing. So there's both federal and state money. It's very competitive. Often projects like ours, and that I think it's true in Western Mass, you often have to wait, and there's often a long wait to get your project funded, especially when there's a lot of applications that come in. You want to go to the next one, Lori? Rental subsidies. So you need the three stools, right? The capital, the rental subsidies, and the support dollars. On the rental side, there's Section 8 that I think most people have heard of, starts out as federal dollars. Massachusetts is one of the few states in the country that has its own vouchers called mass rental vouchers, and very, very competitive to get mass rental vouchers for supportive housing. And vouchers really come a couple of ways. They either get handed to the individual if you qualify, you go out and find your own apartment, or they come to people like us who develop housing and they go with the unit. So most of the vouchers we have are called project-based, and they go with the actual unit. So I want to share and wrap up a little bit with a story about my friend Sam. I've known Sam probably almost my entire time at Pine Street. So Sam came to Pine Street one day. He's got schizophrenia. We never knew and still don't know a whole lot about Sam's history. We know a little bit. We think he lived in New York. We could never find any family. We think he was an electrician at one point in his life. But Sam had untreated schizophrenia and lived in the world I would call no man's land. He was not eligible for services through the Department of Mental Health because he wouldn't go willingly. He was never a danger to himself or anybody else. One of the most gentle people you'll ever meet. Wasn't a threat to anyone, and so he could not be forced into treatment. And Sam literally slept on the floor of Pine Street for a good 10 years before we were able to get Sam housed. And Sam used to show up every night at 2 a.m. and we'd let him in, even though, I think at that point you were supposed to clean your bed by probably 9 o'clock at night. We'd let Sam in, and Sam would sleep on the floor in newspaper. And we tried everything, tried to get him DMH services. We offered him housing. He said no. We just were getting pretty frustrated because we were getting worried about him, his health, but he had no treatment for his mental illness, and that was not helping him with some health issues he had as well. Anyways, we bought this very small building near Pine Street when Housing First was first coming to the forefront. And the Department of Mental Health agreed to give us some staffing dollars and some operating money. And we used private money to buy the building. And we did the work ourselves. It's an 11-unit building. It's very small. And I got a call one Sunday night at home from the fellow who ran the men's shelter who said, Sam wants to go over and see the new building. And I said, great, take him over. This is really exciting. Maybe he'll decide he likes it. So over Sam goes with the shopping cart and his stuff. And he goes in the building up to the top floor, the 4th floor. And Sam turns to our staff person and says, oh, I like this, I'll take it. And he says, I like it because I'm up high and I can see who's coming in and I can lock the door. And so I get a call at home saying, Sam wants to stay. And I said, what do you mean wants to stay? The building, we're not even done with the construction yet. And we decide, well, let's try it. What do we have to lose? Absolutely nothing, right? Sam was going to go back and sleep on the floor at Pine Street, let him sleep in a room. So staff get him a blanket, a pillow, and they say to Samuel, we'll be over in the morning to check on you. They go over in the morning and knock on the door, no answer. And of course they're panicking now thinking, oh my God, what happened? And when they finally get the door open, Sam's sleeping on the floor on newspaper, all his stuff's on the bed. And when they wake him up, he says, I haven't had a good night's sleep in 20 years because when I sleep outside and when I sleep in the lobby, I always have to be on the lookout for somebody who's going to hurt me. And he said, this was great. I could lock the door. And he says, look, can I have this room? And we say, sure. And so Sam moved in. We didn't have any staff. I don't even think we had, honestly, dishes in the kitchen. We brought food over for, a couple months until the building was staffed up. But it changed everything for me and some of us because many of us at Pine Street, including me, thought Sam could never get housed because Sam had so many challenges, right? He had a lot of health issues. He was very thought disordered and couldn't follow through on things. Of course not, because he had untreated schizophrenia. But he's thrived in this building. He loves it. He's kind of the king of the house. He's been there longer than anybody now. And I just credit him for teaching us about Housing First and teaching us that sometimes the simpler, the better. And that we're the ones getting in people's way, frankly, not the Sams of the world. So I think I'll wrap up with that and see if people have questions.
Thank you, Linda. That's quite a situation you all have in Boston that you have created. One of the things in relationship to what you were just talking about is the fact that you all found that scattered small housing was not the best way to go, that the larger was. And could you just highlight why you feel like larger housing units are the most efficient way for you all to meet the needs of the people you're housing?
So I think in Boston, Emily, we've got to get to scale. We have bigger homeless numbers than the rest of the state. Boston traditionally, no surprise, people come to Boston, they end up homeless. We've got a very horrible, tight housing market, just like the rest of the state, but I think Boston's particularly bad. And so I don't know that I would say scattered site isn't a good option. It is a very good option. Of our 850 units right now, probably 300 of those units are apartments that we lease up with private landlords, and we provide support to people. We're not there 24/7 in their apartment the way we are in our own sites, but we're there depending on the need, a couple of times a week, sometimes every day. So my opinion, you do need both. I think though, if we think too small, Emily, we will not impact our homeless numbers. And I think we've been afraid of thinking big in Boston, frankly. And we've broken a bit of a glass ceiling, I would say, with this new building that's going to be 140 units. You know, New York, Washington, LA, other cities are 300, 400, 500 units, and they're much more impactful in terms of hitting the numbers. And the other thing I would say, I think, you know, Nancy mentioned that, you know, the demand in Western Mass was about 2,500 new units. That's very doable. That is doable. You know, if you think of this in 50 unit chunks or 80 unit chunks, right? Hotels, what are the buildings that are in this environment maybe up for sale that could be easily convertible to studio apartments? You know, what we're building now are studio apartments that are about 350 square feet, bathroom, small kitchenette, enough room for a bed, a dresser, little kitchen table, but enough. And you know, folks that have gotten the units like them a lot. They're not too hard to keep up, and we always build some common space so that people can hang with the other tenants if they want or not. So.
Okay. Linda, did you see something in the chat that you wanted to address? I thought at the beginning.
So I was referring to, there was a lot of terrific, I think, questions and comments in the chat before.
Okay, here's one that was in the chat. Boston has a task force working on both problem properties and repeat offender landlords, utilizing a system of additional inspections to try to bring up the quality of units when they do not meet basic health and safety requirements. Are you familiar with this system, and do you have opinions on how well it's working?
I'm not really familiar with it. I'm somewhat familiar with it. It's run through the city's Department of Inspectional Services, but it's triggered mostly by tenant complaints. I mean, there's some really obvious ones, right? Where a building's in terrible shape. There's one in the South End, in fact, that the city has condemned. And if they haven't already, they're about to take it as a tax foreclosure. So the city has a pretty active tax foreclosure process. And that's frankly benefited us, because oftentimes the city will sell these buildings for the back taxes. And they're often properties that go for cheaper than we could buy them on the open market. And I do think it's reasonably successful. You know, one of the challenges I think in Boston is it's hard for them to keep up because there's a lot of stock. And so they probably miss apartments that really do need an inspection. And so I think it's been successful, but there's probably not enough of it, frankly.
Yeah. At this point, I think I'm going to open it up for general questions as well. And I have one that is in there. With a new administration in DC and COVID relief funds, can you talk about your dreams of more money coming to communities for affordable housing, and your crystal ball of what might actually happen and what we can do to prepare to be in the right place at the right time to get money?
Yeah. Here's what I'd say is we're at a very unique opportunity. There will be money around. There'll be one-time money for purchase. There's going to be money, and there is money in this new stimulus package for acquisition. There's money for rehab. There's some money for rental assistance, and there's money for support, which is unheard of, frankly. First time I've seen federal money at this level for support. And so we have to be really nimble. We have to advocate for the state to spend this money where it will really impact homelessness. And we need to be thinking about nursing homes and hotels and rest homes that are vacant and easily convertible and quickly convertible. And then the other piece I would say, and I appreciate Shondel's comment on the racial equity work that's happening. In the city of Boston, every department has a racial equity basically a sheet where data is collected, and we look at, are our placements proportional? If they're not, what are we doing wrong? What have we missed? But the one thing I will say about all of this, and this applies to Western Mass too, is that if we don't address the zoning issue, zoning is a social and racial justice issue. If we don't address zoning, and if every time one of us, whether it's someone in Western Mass or someone in Boston, wants to try and build affordable housing, and the first answer is no, and then the next answer is, yeah, okay, if you build 10 units, we'll let you do it. We've got to work on that. It's the biggest obstacle, funding aside for a minute, it's the biggest obstacle, and it's the biggest obstacle in the state, frankly, and we've got to really be pushing to get more zoning friendly and exemption from zoning for this kind of housing, because what you get when this is so difficult is you get a lot of people don't want to do housing at all because it's just too hard, and then you get these long drawn out, really difficult and expensive processes that slow production down significantly.
Okay. And
I'm wondering whether Kelly or Shondell have thoughts on that particular question.
sure.
I was going to give you a chance, Chandal. Yeah, I mean, this is something that we are already having conversations with. I know there are people on this call right now, actually, who have been in several meetings with me over the last couple of weeks around, our thoughts around what happens in terms of the funding that's coming to this state. Three County is in a unique position that we don't have as much of the funds that just come directly here. So some of the funds will go to the state, then the state will determine how those funds are going to be spent, just like Lindia said. And, then we're going to have to, ask for it and apply for it and try to demonstrate that we have the project in mind that will meet that expectation. And so there are early conversations happening both within Three County, but then also with the state to be encouraging them to keep us in mind around opportunities that are here. I see things happening in the chat right now where people are suggesting locations, and that's awesome. That kind of information is what we're doing right now. We're brainstorming. Where are the locations? Where are the empty buildings? Where are the town of Greenfield does an amazing job of thinking around those things. MJ Adams has always, for many years, been thinking with that development mind, and that's what we need to do right now. And then the other thing that I will say that has already been mentioned is that those supportive service dollars are really necessary. And, we can't build housing opportunities without also saying, okay, well, where's the support services? We have to make sure that that's in line with any of these projects. And I think, that as Lindia said, it's in there, it's in the pie that is being demonstrated with these funds. And that is really exciting for us to see, because most of our partner agencies will say to you, okay, sure, but where are the dollars for that? So, yeah.
Thank you. There's a question. It is a question in the chat that I think we've sort of touched on, but it really is something we're seeing even now with some of the shootings, that there's a lot of mental health problems going on out there, especially since the 80s when we deinstitutionalized very severe mentally challenged people. And the question actually asks, what are we doing to try and provide housing for these people that were just kind of basically thrown out on this, the streets? When you talk about closing down all of these mental institutes that used to exist back in the 70s, 60s, and so forth, is there a special thing that is being looked at for this population to help meet their needs?
So, let me try and answer that if I can, and I'm going to editorialize a little bit. Pine Street's the biggest increase in our population, certainly in Boston and at Pine Street, was after that period of deinstitutionalization. People showed up that didn't get housing through the plan for deinstitutionalization, and many of those people who showed up we could not place them again because they needed housing and support. And at the time, Housing First didn't exist and support services didn't exist. So there's a couple of ways that folks that are mentally ill can get housing. One is through the Department of Mental Health, but you have to be eligible for those services and you have to agree to those services, which sounds so simple, but it's not. You have to be very, very sick, first of all, very sick. And you have to then agree to fill out what is probably a 15-page application to get DMH services. And I point back to my friend Sam, who is incredibly paranoid. There is no way he was going to fill out a 15-page application. Not only could he not do it at the time, he didn't want to do it. And so the barriers are insurmountable for many people, first of all. The Department of Mental Health does have rental vouchers, and they use them for people often leaving group homes so they can free up capacity in a group home. So there is some ability, but it's very limited and it's very targeted. The one thing I will say that we've had some success with are these very, very small programs called safe havens. And that's what my friend Sam is living in at the moment. And what DMH did for Sam is made him presumptively eligible for services so they could give us the funding. And it was a complete game changer because that presumptive eligibility meant that Sam didn't have to jump through all these hoops to get a place to live and to get services. And even though he gets services from us, not directly from DMH, the services have been enough to give him a much better quality of life and housing. But I'll tell you, it is one of our biggest frustrations at Pine Street. We are constantly trying to get folks with mental health issues housed. We're constantly trying to get them services, and we are not often very successful. And even when we resort to forcibly sectioning someone, which we absolutely hate to do, but we only do it if we're worried somebody's not going to make it. I mean, literally somebody is outside and it's, going to be below zero for the next few nights, and we're really worried. 95% of the time, even if we section them, they're back out in the street within a couple of days. So it's very frustrating. We don't have a system. We're hoping some of this safe haven idea will take hold at DMH, and the Coalition for Homeless Individuals and Mahasa and a whole bunch of us are working, Mass Mental Health Association, are really pushing this idea of very low barrier housing for people who are homeless and mentally ill. And it looks like supportive housing, just targeted to this group with, affordability and some support services.
I will just add that exactly the safe havens piece has been a conversation here too. We've been working to push some legislative action to get it here in Hampshire County, and specifically because we're really seeing that there's that gap actually between shelter and transitional housing or permanent supportive housing, specifically for that population, that we really want to see, a higher level. It's basically like shelter with a higher level of support than and longer term than the transitional housing or the permanent supportive housing provides.
Great. Thank you both. And, I hate to say it, but we are at a time limit. And so I do want to thank our speakers that they've given us some incredible information. And I think that we're all scratching our head and saying, what can we do? How can we move forward and help? Kelly, how, even help Linda in the Boston area, because we do have the same type of problems. I also want to thank Nancy for partnering with me and organizing this workshop. And most of all, I want to thank Gabi Perry, who is our tech support. She has been doing all of our workshops as well as the keynotes, and has been a tremendous help. There are so many great questions, and I wish we could continue going on how we can move forward to make housing be a right and not a privilege. We hope you want to continue on this journey with us. And now I'm going to turn it over to Nancy for some next steps.
Thank you so much. I want to thank everybody who came to here for your passion to address this issue and to create safe and affordable housing for all. and your ideas. We've captured everything in the chat room, and we'll be sharing that with you. And please join me in thanking our speakers, Shondell Diaz, Kelly Pereira, and Lindia Downey. They've just been amazing. Thank you so much. And also Lori Alley, who's been sitting with us and working on planning this. And also, I want to thank Emily for her work and planning this, and also for her moderating today. And again, Gabby, as Emily mentioned, has been a huge support. As for next steps, our hopes that today's workshop is a new beginning. It's a beginning of working with commitment, focus, compassion, and understanding to achieve our goal of safe and affordable housing for all. Our hearts brought us here, and from that place, please think about, what change would you like to see? What would you like to contribute? And think about the people you know and what they might like to contribute. Tomorrow, Susan Morgaftic, who's chair of the forum, is going to be sending out an email and ask you if you are willing to have your email shared as we move forward. Next week, Emily and I will be sending out an email that will summarize some of the outcomes of this particular workshop and invite you to continue to work with us. And for right now, we'd like to also invite you to visit our website again, where you signed up originally, and Gabby's going to put that up for you. So there's the URL for our Housing is a Human Right. And check out our coming workshops and sign up and take action. So there's 3 more workshops, and I want to particularly bring your attention to the workshop called "And How Do We Pay for the Housing We Want?" Well, obviously, we heard a lot about where we might find the money, and there is going to be a lot of money coming here. So, but let's sit down and talk about that. And that will be on May 12th. And there's another one that's coming sooner than that, May 5th, is Reclaiming Municipally Owned Abandoned Buildings. So thank you all for joining us, and have a great evening.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.